let's move ahead and understand about modifiers. Now, modifiers are interesting to understand, and so let's talk about it. So, modifiers are essentially a piece of code that runs before and after the function call, right? And so, the main problem it tend to solve is it essentially helps in restrict the access for a certain function. So let's suppose you have a NFT collection, and let's say you have a NFT collection contract, and you want the NFT only be mintable by the person first who deploy the contract, and someone else, the persons who aren't using, who aren't able to mint that, they were just throw with an error of XYZ, right? So you can use modifier in that case, and they are essentially useful for restricting the access for certain piece of functions. Let's say we can add that usable helps in, let's say, helps in restricting access for some functions, right? And the next step which is tend to solve is it essentially increase the usability for your code, because now you're not using now you're not essentially writing or copying the same code every time again. You are just using a modifier to handling all kind of stuff, right? So it also helps in resolving the problem of gas while you're deploying the contract. So we can say helps in we can say helps in the reusability for the code in the contract, right? So they tend to solve the problem, and yeah, they are essentially good in that case. So let's say let's try to make a contract so that you understand in a more brief manner. Let's say we're taking an example over here that suppose that you are a contract owner, and you want the certain piece of NFT can only be mintable by yourself. So you want to make a contract that the person who deploy this contract can only the person who have access for this certain NFT, and they can only the person who can mint this NFT. So you want to make a contract in that case. Let's say we can make the person who deploy this NFT contract can only be the first is only be the person who is able to mint the NFT, right? Something like that. Let's suppose and start our work. Let's say make an address of let's say public of owner. Let's say make a bool of can mint NFT, right? So this is a boolean which is essentially set to null. And now let's make a constructor. Okay, let's make a constructor. Now this constructor is essentially setting the owner whosoever deploy the contract. Let's say I deploy the contract, so it's setting the owner is equals to message.sender. And then let's say make a function of start. It's going to be public. Okay, now we essentially want to so now we can able to access this by using require. So we want whenever whenever person start this contract, we want to set can mint NFT is equals to maybe like true, right? So now it may throw an error, or maybe like say we can even add a require statement right over here that makes more sense for contract. So let's say add a require statement that if the owner is equals to message dot sender, then you're good. But if you don't, then throws an error that you don't have access to mint this NFT, right? So this is a simple program that essentially first this constructor will run, and whosoever deploy the contract is essentially the owner, and the owner who deploy the contract is able to mint the NFT. So it's basically a simple contract. And now let's say compile the contract. So it's, oh yeah, so we need to add this statement, then the contract. Now it works fine. Compile it, it's work fine. Now we just let's say I am deploying this from this account. Deploy, make this a bit so you have to see this. Let's say deploy the contract, and let's say the star. So if I click on this owner is the person who deploys the contract. Let's say in my case this is the owner who's ending with DDC4 account number, ending with DDC4. And let's say if I click on this start, it essentially successfully runs the transaction. Just in case if I, let's say, change my account and then essentially start the, let's say, run this function, then it will show me an error. The error states that you don't have access to mint this NFT, right? That's how you can make a simple function that essentially test and give you an error. And this is essentially useful to restrict the access for certain functions. Let's say let's say in our function, or maybe like if you're making multiple functions, we want to repeat the same line. Let's say if you're making function of let's say we have this multiple functions, right? So we have this multiple functions that do the same task. They essentially search for the message.sender and they throws you an error, right? So this is essentially a lot of code repetition in your contract, and that shows an impact on the gas fee. So to optimize the contract, to make it more usable and just make it more appealing, we can remove this code repetition and try to make a modifier right at the top. Let's say we can, instead of this line, instead of adding this require statement right over here, you can make a simple modifier that essentially, say, made a modifier that modifier essentially just make it like only owner, which means that only this owner can able to mint this, have this access to this function. Let's say we make the same statement and copy right over here, and just move this extra spacing right over here. Yeah, so we have this simple modifier right over here that's the same thing, and we are using this right over here. And now we able to, now once we do that, we need to also able to add this thing. So even we can add this at the top, means by adding this statement, this essentially gives the access to the person that they can easily run the code from afterward. Let's say we have this, and now it's compiled successfully. Now we can able to give it a modifier. Let's say if I copy this right over here and paste it, now this behaves the same way. If I compile the contract and again deploy it, deploy this from this, and it's showing me the same thing. And let's say owner is me, start successfully. And then if I change the contract and then start it throw me an error stating that let's say, hey, you don't have access to mint this NFT, right? So this is essentially usable if you have multiple lines of, if you have multiple functions. You just need to copy this. So if you have multiple functions, let's say if you have this multiple function, you just need to copy this only owner function instead of adding this entire line again and again, right? So that's how you can able to optimize the contract and use this kind of keyword whenever using use modifier.